With behavior, what's really tricky is people assume that behavior can just shift. Behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs within a context, and we all have a responsibility within that context. We always talk about behavior icebergs, and what we see above the surface is so small. And it doesn't mean it's impossible by any means. It means we have to create multiple opportunities to practice behavior change.
How does trauma impact our behavior over time?
So it's the same idea in terms of experiences. So
Chelsea Troutman is a board-certified behavioural analyst with a Masters of Education in School Psychology from the University of Cincinnati and a postgraduate degree in Criminology from the University of Melbourne. With international experience across government and community service sectors, Chelsea brings deep expertise in behaviour, complex trauma and forensic behavioural contexts. In this episode, we hone in on understanding behaviour in context, including creating safe workplaces that create opportunities for success. Stay tuned, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Chelsea Troutman, welcome to the show.
hello.
We're going to jump straight in because I have so much I want to ask you. Let's start with the basics. How do you define behavior and what has the biggest impact on it over time?
This is behavior. Sitting here is actually behavior, to be fair. I think we all jump to really exciting part of behavior, which is the pointy in. It's far more about behaviors of concern or it becomes a problem. But behavior is really any interaction with the world. And it's both the external world around us and it's our internal world. And what shapes behavior is this theory called behavior goes where reinforcement flows. So effectively, if it serves us, if it feels good, if it makes sense, if it's meaningful to me, then I'm going to keep doing that behavior. If I sit here and I don't fall down on the ground, I'm going to sit in this chair in this way because that makes sense. If I drink water in the morning because I feel good, I'm going to keep drinking water. If I drink coffee first thing in the morning, I'm going to create a pattern where I keep drinking coffee because it feels good. So behavior flows or shapes or is strengthened where reinforcement flows.
I love that saying. It makes so much sense. I want to know, how does trauma impact our behavior over time?
So it's the same idea in terms of experiences. So all of our experiences shape behavior. Why? Because it shapes the way we interact with the world. And unfortunately, if you've experienced some form of harm, chronic stress, significant trauma, it's going to affect the way we feel about ourselves. It's going to affect the way our brain and our body develops. And it's going to affect the way we interact with the world in general. So that naturally is going to have a flow-on effect in the way we behave. And it flows in terms of our arousal management. It flows in terms of the way we handle stress and coping, how we feel about ourselves, if we feel like we're worthy of things. It's the scripts we tell ourselves. It affects us in so many different ways, which influences our behaviors. And it's really important to think about trauma plays out in ways that it's how we interact in certain scenarios. I often say what sits between fear and hope is trust. And you actually have to feel trusting of yourself. You have to feel quite safe in the situation. So you have to trust others around you in order to move forward. And we're going to behave in a way that's highly regulated and that's highly adaptive in the circumstances if we feel safe and we can trust the situation. Unfortunately, trauma plays out in ways that teaches us we can't trust people or we can't trust situations. And our body is trained and our brain is trained to believe that this is unsafe. So anything that feels scary is considered a threat to us. And our body naturally saves us, it protects us. And so we behave in a way that's quite protective. It's just unfortunately, what you're seeing may not really be that unsafe. So what happens is we actually create adaptive responses. So we're adapting to the threat that may not actually be a threat. And so in that environment, in that circumstance, it becomes maladaptive. And so essentially, your protective behaviors aren't serving you anymore. They're not required. But it takes a lot of effort to actually reshape that, reframe that, and actually still feel safe and actually trusting. So trauma affects the way our brain and our body develops, and it affects the way we interact with the world based on that sense of fear.
That's so important. I think that is something that is often really misunderstood. And so I just want to ask you a little bit more about that because I think that something people may struggle to understand is the idea that, as you said, a behavior is really adaptive in a certain context or at a certain period of our life. And then later on, maybe, for example, in our adult relationships or workplace relationships, we no longer need that behavior and it is no longer adaptive for us. Can you just explain that a little bit further? Because I think that concept is really important for people to grasp.
Yeah, adaptive means we're naturally evolving and adapting to situations. So when you walk into the room, you're always going to read the room, right? You figure out what the dynamics are, what the culture is, and you try to adapt to that situation. And you're going to adapt in a way that is reinforcing or that serves you. It's just sometimes when you have history or past experiences that have taught you that's not a safe situation, we might engage in maladaptive ways. So our environment has a lot to play in this. The context has a lot to play in this. Environment shapes behavior. So when we think about a workplace, for example, we often focus in on the problem behavior, right? We focus in on someone who's having a hard time. We focus in on that problem behavior. We forget the behavior is actually exacerbated or strengthened or occurring in the environment that's essentially reinforcing it. So if you think about a behavior that's maladaptive, it's no longer serving them, right? So there's not a threat response, but there's also not enough in that environment to counter that threat response. So this can be quite confusing, but if you think about a young child in a school, in a classroom, and they feel like maybe a teacher says something directive to them, they might activate a stress response and they might run away. And that's because they're protecting themselves in that situation from potential harm. The risk is in that situation, they don't need to run away. It's maladapted. They don't need to run away from the environment. There's no threat, but not enough work has actually done to explain to the child, you are safe here. And this is what we can do together. And we're gonna reframe the situation. We're gonna make sure that it's highly adaptive for you to feel safe here and that you can trust me. So if you think about in a work context, for example, instead of having maladaptive responses to this culture, you would sit there and say, this is a problem behavior that's occurring. Where is this coming from? What has the person been through to actually lead to this behavior? So what's the story behind all of this? Where is this all coming from? And trying to actually understand the story behind it, trying to understand how to create safety, psychological safety and physical safety for everyone in that environment. That's the first thing you have to do for people to actually then create new behaviors within a safe environment that's highly adaptive. So the maladaptive behavior comes out when there's a threat response. That means we have to put a lot of emphasis on the environment to make sure people feel safe and secure. It's not just the problem behavior in isolation of anything else. Behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs within a context, and we all have a responsibility within that context.
Yeah, and I love how you've broken that down in those 2 parts. So there's sort of the historical part of it that is that giving you that cue where that person's experiencing that environment as unsafe, even though, someone else looking in may think that environment looks safe to them, but there's something happening there for them. So understanding that story. And then the second part, which is really important because I think when we get stuck in workplace situations, we feel like, oh, that's something that's related to their past. We can't do anything about that. But the second part that you're highlighting is that's so important is that context. So creating that safe context for that individual. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like how someone can create that safe context for someone?
I think it actually starts with being really explicit upfront. So at our company, we have a pyramid around safety, and we talk about practice leadership is well-being. You cannot separate professional behaviors and well-being. They're they are intertwined. Absolutely, they're intertwined. Because if you can behave in a safe way, if you can be well and you can be socially and emotionally attuned and aware, then you're naturally going to be able to thrive in a workplace setting. So I think it starts with being really explicit from the very beginning in terms of the expectations of culture. And at the very foundation, you are safe. You have your basic needs met here. You are able to communicate to anyone around you if you are not feeling comfortable, if something's going on. Foundationally, your basic needs are met. And then you're going to move up a level and you're going to say, my voice matters. So it's not just that I can communicate, it means people are going to listen to me. I can be myself and people are going to genuinely listen to me. And it may not always go my way, but that's okay because my voice matters. It's respected. I'm empowered here. And then you're going to go up another level and you're going to say, oh, I belong here. These people, these people are actually caring for me. They genuinely want me here. They want me to succeed. I belong here. And so it's about being explicit from the very beginning of this is our culture and this is what drives us. And it's all around your sense of safety. So if you can meet those personal needs and then you provide motivation, so reinforcement, you provide motivation on top of that, then with motivation and opportunity, people thrive. So we're never starting from a hole where there's problem behaviors. You're never starting from there. You're always starting from a foundation of I matter. I have purpose. I belong here. I am safe here. People genuinely want to support me. And then you can go into, wow, I know if I do this, this leads to really good outcomes, that I'm motivated and that my team around me are motivated. And I'm going to have opportunities to actually trial this. I'm going to have opportunities to practice. With behavior, what's really tricky is people assume that behavior can just shift, right? But patterns are entrenched. They're entrenched in our nervous system. They're entrenched in our cells. They're entrenched in our presentation, how we show up every day. So they're so entrenched that it takes a lot of time and effort to actually reshape behavior. And it doesn't mean it's impossible by any means. It means we have to create multiple opportunities to practice behavior change. People have to have multiple opportunities to feel successful, to feel like they can do it. It's when you have one go and it feels too hard, even if you're really motivated, even if you really want to change your weight goals, right? You really, really want to change your weight goals. You want to go to the gym. You're super motivated. But the only time your schedule fits is 5 a.m. You're not a morning person. And you're like, oh, God, this is too hard. Not doing this, right? You're quick. You're quick to say, I can't do it. That
I
is
hear this
way
one.
That is way too hard. Why? Because we always started from in the hole. We've always started on the back burner. We've never started from the place of success. We've never started creating opportunities to practice and actually be successful. So with behavior, it's really tricky. We often just want to fix the problem behavior. And I say, no, go in, work with the things that are actually going well, strengthen those, and then create so many opportunities to practice those really foundational behaviors, those prerequisite skills we need to leverage from in other situations. Practice those, create opportunities to feel successful, to feel capable. That motivation just drives us. And then we get the motivation of, I belong here and I can see other people cheering me on. Geez, this feels really good. I'm going to keep going. Right. And then you have a bump in the road and you fall down and then you do the whole thing again. And that's okay. Right. But that's life. It's just we have to always start from the point of success and opportunity and motivation more than in the hole. And I'm going to have to climb my way out of it. That feels really, really tough.
I love that. I love that you're starting with the culture because it isn't about waiting till the behavior presents. It's about let's create the right context from the get-go. Let's create this culture where it's not just about safety, but it's creating opportunities to thrive. And that's where we see all the creativity, isn't it? That's where we can be our most productive, our most efficient, is when we feel safe in those contexts. So I love that sort of the starting point that you're looking at. And, when you were talking, I was thinking about I don't know if they still do this in workplaces, but that old school mentality where you kind of step through the plan of like you've got your first warning, your second warning. I'm thinking about, old school days of like when you worked at McDonald's. If you ever had one of those kind of jobs. And, and it's just such a punitive approach, isn't it? And it's sort of as you said, you've got this like one chance. And as soon as you get it wrong, then you're back down the bottom. And so it's shifting away from that and recognizing that it takes multiple opportunities, multiple times of making mistakes, correcting ourselves to be able to shift behavior. How would you say that we can create those opportunities in a workplace context if we're, say, for example, leading someone?
So you hit the nail on the head right there is creating opportunities, what I would fix to say, to practice. So people underestimate how much effort it actually needs to practice skills. So we're not just giving people the opportunity to engage in the same behavior over and over and fail. We need to present opportunities and we need to stand with them and teach them the behaviors that will actually allow them to succeed. So that's the part that's really in practice. We actually need to practice those skills. We need to actually find what are we good at, how to build upon those, and then teach the skills that actually make them stronger. Opportunities are really important. So creating opportunities, but it's never allowing someone to go off on their own to engage in an opportunity that we know they're going to fail in because they haven't actually been taught new behaviors or new skills to actually help them succeed. There's an idea around recognizing the difference between can't and won't. And there are circumstances people say, no, won't do that. That's not understanding where that comes from, right? Can't is very different. And in most instances, I would say people avoid situations because it feels really tough. And it feels tough for lots of reasons. And one of them is it's too demanding. I don't have the skills for this. This is terrifying. This links to a lot of my fears. I don't trust myself. I don't have confidence to do this. So a lot of times, opportunity in itself is actually not enough. It's opportunity plus teaching someone the skills to be capable in that moment. I talk to my kids all the time, and it's not my job to save them from situations ever. It's not my job to punish their behaviors all the time. It is my job to remind them they are extremely capable. And when they fall down, I will be there to pick them up and I will be there to support them. But they're extremely capable and they will put one foot in front of the other and they'll keep going. And I say it all the time, even to my 5-year-old. I just remind her, you are extremely capable. And that's so important because if we want to change behavior, if we want to have new opportunities, we have to step into that space saying, I am capable. And so it's the teaching, it's the practicing that's really, really important. Well, it's when you were saying about the warnings, for example, that's tricky because boundaries are so good. I love boundaries. I love teaching people from the outset expectations, saying, if this doesn't work, this is what will happen. But it's never just on the person because behavior occurs within a context. So really, you might give a warning and say, if this happens, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion and we're going to work out what's going on, what's getting in the way. We're going to figure out what do you need to succeed? What do I need to do? I'm going to reflect and I'm going to listen intentionally. And that's really important, isn't it? Because we're actually starting from the side of you are safe here, you belong, I want to see you succeed. It's not all on you in isolation. So the warnings are really important if they're actually set as boundaries. And what it means is you're not just punishing someone at each stage, which means they're more likely to avoid you. Instead, it's actually saying these are touch points. If this occurs, I'm going to step in and provide some feedback straight away. And I'm going to do it in a really safe way that we can learn and reshape behavior and essentially try to avoid it happening again. And if it does happen again, well, that's another touch point. And I'm going to have to figure out how to support you in a different way, right? And then that's a very different approach than punishment.
I love that because it is recognizing that, there is this broader context and the context needs to change. It's not all about focusing in on the behavior and the behavior itself. And when I was listening to you talk, I was also thinking a lot about relationships, obviously, as a couples therapist. But what I loved you talking about was this idea of skills and not having those skills yet. And even that doesn't change the intention. So someone may want to do something, but they don't have the skills yet to do that. And I find that a lot in relationships. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around someone who maybe can't sit in difficult emotion, for example, or can't provide the empathy that's needed, not because they don't want to, not because the intention isn't there, but they haven't developed the skills yet. So I want to ask you a bit about relationships. Tell me, how can we understand our partner's behavior in a relational context?
I think the first thing is really about defining behavior. It's defining what is your partner doing that's great, that you love, that you appreciate. What are those good things? And then clearly define what are those areas that you struggle with. And so it's about understanding your partner's behavior in terms of you. Because in reality, what they're doing is probably reinforced by themselves. It serves them, but it just may not serve you. It may not, be positive for you. And that's where you're dancing, right? You're always trying to dance together. You're always trying to figure out how we can marry up these different behaviors so that it's mutually beneficial without taking away the individuality. So I would say the first thing is really recognizing What are those really good behaviors? And then what are those behaviors that are a bit tricky or really, really
And
tough?
we all have them. We have them too. Our partner has them, and we have them as well.
That's right. And so we always say with behavior, the first step is defining it. And so there's no judgment, there's no ambiguity, there's no fluff. It's really saying this is the behavior specifically and really getting to the point of defining that behavior. Then the next phase is for you to think, why does this behavior bother me so much? What is happening? And that goes back to maybe my needs aren't being met, right? Maybe it affects me because of my own past and this, I can't handle conflict in this way. So my partner may be very direct in their communication style and I'm not at all. And I find it really confronting when they're so directive. And they may say, I may be speaking personal, but they may be saying, I'm relaying this information. I really want you to hear it. It's really important. I'm trying to communicate with you. And they believe they're saying it from a very good place that's so meaningful, but the way you hear it is stressful. And so your brain and your body shuts down a little bit. And so it's actually, they're not necessarily doing something wrong, but the way I'm receiving it is wrong for me. So I need to figure out how to adjust the situation so I can hear it, I can engage in this conversation. So I think when you think about your partner's behavior, you have to recognize what are the good, what are the tricky points, and then why is it hard for me? And then be able to communicate that and saying, this is actually tough for me when you do this because of how it affects me, or these are my needs. It always goes back to that reflection. And I would say that's probably in the interaction side. The other side is when you see patterns in behavior of your partner that are harmful, um, not necessarily on the spectrum of abuse, but just harmful behavior that's just not it's not productive in your relationship. I would start to think, what are their triggers? What are their triggers right now? What's actually precipitating this behavior change? Because it's typically an acute change. What's triggering these changes? What's triggering the stress response? Normally, it's around stress and coping. What's triggering this? And then instead of just stopping there, asking yourself and then asking your partner, why is this triggering this? What's the story behind the trigger? Freedom lies in understanding that. It's not just saying they're stressed because of money. It's saying they're stressed because of money because their value base is I must provide for my family and I feel like I'm letting them down and I have a big shame response. They may not be able to articulate that, but it is really about understanding what are the triggers that are actually getting in the way or precipitating this behavior change? Why is that a trigger for them? And then it's really about understanding where they're coming from. What's the story behind the behavior? As much as recognizing our own story. There's an iceberg. We always talk about behavior icebergs, and what we see above the surface is so, so small. And then underneath the surface, there's patterns in our attachment styles and our personality, in our environment, and our culture. Right? There's so many patterns that fall there. And then right below our patterns is personal needs. And so all of that is actually functioning underneath the behavior. And with our partners, we have to understand there's a whole story behind it. And that's kind of the joy of a relationship is actually understanding that story and trying to get to know it. But it's tough. It is really tough. And it's tough in general. In my work, I find it extremely difficult is asking people to actually work through that process because it takes time and vulnerability.
I love how you broke it down there in terms of sort of understanding yourself, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, and then really understanding your partner and their behavior. And I love that you not only talked about sort of like taking that moment to think about for yourself what might be triggering them, but asking them. And I think it sounds like such a simple step, but it's a step that a lot of people miss because a lot of people get caught in trying to understand the behavior in their own mind without sort of communicating with their partner and saying, "Hey, what's going on there for you?" And obviously, we know when we do that, we can make a lot of assumptions. So that's one part of it. But importantly, what you're highlighting, I think, is that we're missing the story from our partner. And we're also not allowing our partner to have that opportunity to reflect on what's happening for them and to have that experience of us holding that space and, them feeling heard in their story, which I think is really important. I want to hear your thoughts on on that part, the importance of, hearing that from our partner, hearing their story from them.
Oh, it's so important. And if you think about the original conversation, behaviors are the way we interact with the world. And so our experiences shape everything. And so unless we can hear it from their language, their phrases, if we just need to hear their experience, their story. We also need to hear in a way of what they're willing to give you. There's a whole side to communication. There's the implicit, the explicit. There's so many layers to communication, right? And it's very important to actually do it in phases or build it over time. You have to nurture trust. You have to nurture it. You actually have to work really hard at nurturing this. And so I think hearing it from their experience is so important because my experience of a situation is drastically different from someone else's. Especially you say someone has a trauma response. They're going to walk into a room and have a stress response or a threat response compared to I might walk in a room and say, "Oh, this is great. Right? This is awesome." We have very different responses to an environment based on our experiences. So we can never come in with a judgment or a bias in what's happening for someone else. It is so important for them to feel like their words matter, their experience matters, their story matters, and the way they want to tell their story matters. And just holding space for that is actually part of the process. I would say part of the healing process, but it's part of the behavior change process because through that is actually talking out loud about behaviors, is talking out loud about motivations and reinforcement. So I think it's critical. And I would say it's across the board. Even it's not just with your partners, but with children. Think about in a classroom, there's so many times that teachers trying to manage multiple kids. And it's really, I feel for them, it's really tough because they're trying to seek order in this environment. Right. And a kid really needs to have someone sit down and say, "How are you experiencing this situation right now?" And they may not have the words to tell you, but they may be able to give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. And that just opens the door of conversation. So I would say across the board, actually empowering everyone to have a voice and actually talking through how they're experiencing the situation is extremely powerful.
It's so important. It's important in our friendships, with our colleagues, with our children. And I love how you highlighted there also just meeting them where they're at, because I think what can happen is sometimes we can go into a conversation, particularly in relationships. I think this is the case. Obviously, with children, we have a different experience where we know we might have to help them find some of the language and the words, but obviously in an adult context, it's a little bit different. So I think what can happen is if we are feeling disconnected from our partner, we're aware something's going on, and maybe we have good emotional language, maybe we feel more comfortable in those more emotionally vulnerable contexts, we can go into that conversation and expect our partner to be there, to be in that same place where they're ready to open up and share, maybe something that's really traumatic for them in their past, but they're not quite there yet. So I'm just thinking if someone's listening to this and honestly, because I know they're probably listening think, "I want that conversation. I wanna have that conversation with my partner. I wanna create that safe space for them." But they may have had some attempts in the past and it hasn't landed well. What would you suggest to them? Like, how do they open that conversation up? How do they create that safe space for their partner who may not be as comfortable talking about their emotions, for example?
Thing is wanting it is actually about us. And so it is really tricky in this moment because we desperately this person who's listening to this probably wants this love. They want the connection. They feel like opening this door will resolve a lot of things, a lot of problems. The thing is, opening that door is a huge thing for the other individual. And it's a lot of work that goes with it. And it's a lot of healing that might need to go with it. And a lot of other things might flow out. So realistically, in the first instance, it's always just reminding your partner, you're safe. I'm here for you. It's creating that safe environment for them. I think it's about validating and saying, I actually think there's a lot of pain that's actually leading to this situation. I can see there's probably a lot of pain under the surface, and I'm here to talk when you're ready. Otherwise, you might want to speak to someone else about it if you don't feel comfortable. I think encouraging our partners to actually seek help when they need to and just validating their experiences. It looks like there's probably pain here, and it might be coming from a place of stress. Or I think in my instance, a lot of times I always think first is compassion first. If I can just show compassion in the moment, I'm not going to hide behind if something's affecting me, I'm not going to ignore it. I'm going to acknowledge it, but I'm going to recognize in that moment, this probably isn't the time. We use a saying, you can't teach someone to swim when they're drowning. So in that moment, that's not the time. That's not the time to address it. My needs are very important. I do need to address my needs, and I'm going to need to find space and time to do this where we can both listen. But right now, I'm going to hold compassion and just recognize there's probably a lot of pain under the surface. And when you're ready, I'm here. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere. I trust you. You are safe here. I think it's really tough, but I think that's really probably where we need to start from is just validating there's a lot more under the surface than what we probably know and see, and just saying, I can see that. And when you're ready, I'm here to listen, or I'm here to support you. Talk to someone else.
I love that because I think that is so common in relationships, isn't it? That we try and have these conversations when the other person is emotionally flooded. And I'm thinking I'm going to stereotype for a moment because we do see stonewalling or flooding or shutdown or freeze actually more commonly in men in relationships. And I also think men have less opportunities to learn emotional language, to practice these skills. Have a lot of opportunities in our friendships to practice these skills or in broader contexts. And I think quite often that moment can happen in the heat of an argument when both partners are flooded, both partners are in that state of fight, flight, freeze. And for the male, typically is presenting more in that shutdown state. So, as you said, they're drowning in that moment. So the ability to find language, to explain their story, to communicate just isn't there in that context. What can we do in those kind of moments where someone is in that sort of fight, flight, freeze? How can we sort of reset?
I often talk about we're not managing behavior, we're managing arousal. And so, really, at that point, I would say focus on arousal. Think about stress and coping. How am I responding to the stress? How are they responding to this stress? Nurture your nervous system. Breathe. Give yourself give yourself some deep breaths. There's lots of research that talks about breathing. Breathe. You think about communication, right? We use so much language when we speak. And when you're in a stressful situation or your stress response goes up, your executive functioning reduces, which is where a lot of your communication comes from. So you're naturally compromised in that environment. You're more likely to say something impulsively. You're not going to say something that you truly mean. You probably regret it after the fact, right? You actually want to nurture your capacity to have this conversation. You want to breathe. You might go have a glass of water. You might take a step away. You might actually just do some key movement that actually shows in that space, we probably just need to breathe, right? You might do some signals to each other in advance and just to prepare yourselves and just to plan, explicitly plan and say, it doesn't serve us both to have this conversation. This is our kind of referee moment. We're just going to take a breath, right? You have to agree to it when you're both in a really calm state so that it doesn't become patronizing and that just triggers someone else, right? But
Mhm.
you'd have
Or
to set
point
an
the
agreement.
finger.
That's right. So you have to set you do have to set some ground rules in advance and an agreement. But I would say nurture your nervous system, manage the arousal first. If you manage your arousal, your capacity to communicate your needs is far better. Your capacity to listen to your partner's needs and their conversation is far better. So it goes back to it's not just skill and will, it's about do I have the capacity in this moment to actually change my behavior, change the outcome of this situation? Probably not because we're drowning. So take a breath, walk away, come back. There's different preferences in terms of our sensory input. Some people like quite calm music to really calm the system. Other people like really loud music, to help the nervous system respond. There's lots of different things we can do that are our personal preferences. Create your own toolkit in terms of what actually nourishes your body and your nervous system. Manage arousal, not the behavior.
I love that. That's so important to focus on because I think we can get really caught in the behavior. And when we do, it tends to keep us in that situation, doesn't it? And it escalates even further.
I'll say it's this bias. We see the behavior and it triggers us. And there's this bias of they're doing this to me. And it fuels more fire. It fuels more energy. It leads to so much frustration. And it just can just spiral. And so it's that bias that's so important. So if you recognize this behavior is triggered by stress, there's something else happening. The behavior is a stress response. Let's manage our stress and then let's deal with the trigger. But let's deal with it when we're calm so it doesn't have to happen again. It's a stress response. But if you go in straight and manage a behavior, it's coming with so much judgment and so much bias that actually makes it really tricky for you to actually regulate your own behavior in that circumstance.
Absolutely. And I love where you've brought it there because it's coming back to what you talked about earlier, which I really appreciated the words that you used when you were looking at interpreting our partner's behavior. So if we see a behavior from our partner, one of the things that you said that we need to do is ask ourselves, why is this hard for me? And I think that that is such an important question because I think we can get so caught focusing in on what we see, and I often say I think there's a bit of a bias because you can see your partner's behavior, you can see what's happening with them. And so we can get caught in the narrative of like why they're doing this, why they're saying this thing, why they're acting this way, instead of looking at what is this triggering in me or why is, as you said, why is this hard? This conversation was so interesting and there was simply too much to unpack in one episode, so we kept the conversation going. Look out for part 2 coming next week. Subscribe for more conversations filled with new insights, inspiration, and practical tools to create a life you love.